today we're going to be looking at a fairly specific kind of aspect of drawing, but it's really really crucial to kind of making your drawings more sophisticated. We just finished with a series on charcoal portrait drawing, and an important aspect which I tried to emphasize through that series was how much time you should spend on your dark halftones, so those transitions from the lights into the shadows. And I just want to kind of look at the more technical aspect of how those halftones function and why they're important. And we're going to use a few examples. Just going to find my pencil. I seem to have any with leads. Just going to find one. This one will do the trick. So I'm just going to use some kind of general conceptual diagrams basically for this lesson. So we're not drawing anything specifically, just thinking about this concept. So I want you to think about what happens kind of as light passes over a surface and why something becomes a halftone. So you'll have watched, hopefully be aware of, when I've done sphere diagrams in the past. We've got a sphere and you have the kind of lightest part of the sphere, and gradually that sphere turns away from light and eventually becomes a shadow. I'm just going to zoom out slightly so you guys can see a bit more. It's quite close in. So if we think of that sphere, so let's imagine that sphere, some part of that sphere is this curve here. Draw a curve on the page. And the light source is coming from this direction here, so this is the light source. So the light's passing, kind of all the light rays are running in this direction across the surface, and at a certain point, probably like sort of here, the surface of the sphere is no longer receiving light, so this becomes shadow. So I'm sure you guys are aware of that, hopefully. You've seen that by now. So this becomes our division of light. Now, as the, I'll just drop this down a bit. So as the sphere turns around more towards the light surface, if there's any texture to it, so say any ridges, say it wasn't a perfect sphere but had these kind of ridges on it that kind of wrapped around, from this side light is going to fill all of these divots, so there's not going to be as much shadow. But as the light starts to rake, starts to cast shadows, so all of this will end up in shadow, a little bit of that will end up in shadow, all of this will end up in shadow, a little bit will end up in light. And what happens is the texture, even though the texture is the same all the way around the edge, becomes more exaggerated as it gets nearer the shadow, because the light, it's called raking light, so basically the light just rakes over the surface of these forms rather than hitting it head on like it does in the flatter bits. So I'm just going to move to a different page. And what that means is the texture becomes, whatever the texture is of that surface becomes more apparent the more that the light is raking. Now, a fairly sort of clear example of this, a good way to think about it, is if you think of the moon. So let's going to make an actual sphere here now. So we've got circle shape there, and we've got a moon that's sort of partially lit, and this is like those sphere diagrams that we use to kind of think about form. So the moon is lit here, the sun's illuminating it from this direction over here, so all the light rays, as I say, are travelling kind of in this direction past it. So all of this side roughly is going to be in shadow, so we can shade that in. So we'll shade all this in, but we'll think about the fact that the whole surface of the moon is covered in craters. So basically it's pockmarked by craters all the way around. So let's get this fairly evenly shaded in. A little bit of a bedbug line, so a bit darker at this edge. So that's our sort of standard sphere. But let's think about all these craters. So if we just start drawing, we'll draw some. Maybe draw them, kind of suggest that they're sort of wrapping around the form of the moon. Getting more round as they're kind of more head on. Just randomly place them all over the surface, and we're going to kind of look at these and think about how they'd be affected by the light once I've placed them. So let's put lots of them over this surface, put some in the shadows. So they just carry on all the way around the surface of the moon. We're doing this in a fairly simplistic way. We're doing a lot of craters as well. So up here, maybe put some that are sort of pock-marked out at an angle. Something like that. So we'll just redraw the edge of this moon shape. So as I say, it's sort of slightly lumpy, it's not a perfect circle all the way around. Going to end up with a pretty realistic moon here. So we've got our kind of pockmarks in now, our craters on this moon surface. Now, as I say, the light source is going to be perpendicular to this form, so the moon is kind of lightest at this point here, all this is being illuminated. And if we think of those, that surface again, that edge, when the light's coming from this direction, even if there's a big kind of obvious crater, all of that crater surface is being illuminated by the light. But if the light is coming perpendicular, so at a right angle to that light source, then this side of the crater is going to be really bright, but this side is going to be completely in shadow. Then bright again, then completely in shadow. So it makes for a very different sort of form. So we think about these ones here, you know, you might get an ever so subtle sense that one side of them is slightly in shadow, but it's not very exaggerated. And maybe that side there will be in shadow a little bit as well, but mostly they're going to be in light. However, once you get to this point here, you know, half the crater, maybe more, is going to start being in shadow. So the ridge of that crater is going to start casting a shadow within the crater. Then the other edge of the crater is also going to cast a little shadow going this way. So it gets this kind of compounding effect of texture being created. So we'll do that to all these ones, give them all quite dramatic shadows. Just all the way along this line, because they're all going to be affected in a similar way. We're assuming they're similar sorts of craters, but maybe it starts to get gradually less, or it would start to get gradually less as these craters start to get closer to the light source until eventually we get to here, and you know, there's only a thin sort of line. And you can see that's roughly like if you look at a cratered moon surface, that's what happens. It's kind of slightly cartoony, this obviously simplified, but it's essentially what's going on. Now equally, as I say, along this edge, some of these craters, let's see if I can erase a little bit here. Some of these craters, even in the shadow side, because they're kind of sitting slightly proud, are going to catch a little bit of light as well. So all along that edge, we're going to start to get some extra texture as well. maybe a little double crater in here. Equally, we might start to get a little bit of kind of reflected light bouncing up and filling those craters as well, but what we're mainly concerned with is the kind of more extreme sense of texture along this edge. So any kind of like imperfections in the surface of the moon are going to be exaggerated along this more pronounced edge. Obviously this is a fairly kind of abstract situation to be looking at, but it's an easy way to kind of think about how this kind of effect of texture exaggerating around about your halftones actually works. So if we were to give the moon a little bit of form, we would make those illuminated bits a little bit of lighter than the halftones actually starting to turn away. These darker halftones that would just naturally be curving in as with any form. And start to give it a bit more of a sense of it turning. Now, the important takeaway from this is I've not really spent that much time working on most of the moon's surface. If I put all my efforts into just kind of working this edge, this halftone line, this dark halftone moving into the shadow, the rest of the moon sort of emerges, and our brain starts to kind of read what's going on there based on what we're told from this section here. And that's what's really important, because this same principle then applies to any sort of surface that we're drawing. So from the point of view of any kind of textured object, so if you were doing a still life and you had, say like the surface of a bone, it's going to be kind of pockmarked and broken, similar to a cratered surface of the moon like this. If you're drawing a portrait that has wrinkly skin, say an older person, then at the halftones you're going to spend time. What people often do with kind of wrinklier figures or wrinklier skin tones is they start to try to kind of put lines over everything, so they just kind of make it all scratchy and liney. But that's not really what wrinkled skin looks like. It tends to be like this, so it'll be more apparent. You want to put more texture at the halftones and less texture in the lighter parts. So the lighter parts of the skin will still look quite kind of soft and washed out, well, not washed out but bleached out, because all of that part of the surface is receiving the light source directly, the same as what happens here. But as we start to get nearer the edge of the shadow and the light is raking, any grooves, any wrinkles within the skin will start to become more pronounced. So it's something you really need to be aware of and look out for. Well, by being aware of it, you're more able to look out for it when you're actually working from a subject. So even before you actually start necessarily drawing it or applying your drawings, just try to look for those textures. And if possible, if you've got a movable light, you can shift it around. I'm just going to, as a final thing, actually get a skull just to demonstrate this. So I've just got this deer skull here now, just as an example, because there are some interesting textures on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop my light off. So excuse me if the light goes a bit wacky. So I've got my light source, just going to focus that back in again now. So we've got our light source down very close to the skull, So now you can see if I start to kind of rotate the surface, the edge of that halftone is always where we see the texture. So let's rotate it around. You can see just there, loads of texture appearing. But as I rotate that more into the light, the texture becomes less and less apparent. And it'll start to show more on those parts of the skull that are actually catching the halftone. I roll it back and you can see that texture becomes really pronounced. This texture just here. Try to find some other, this part of the skull's quite textured as well. So you can see those holes in the skull start to all become super pronounced as it rotates, and it gets more catching more of those halftones. So hopefully that's another kind of example of what I'm talking about. So this is what you want to look for if I was drawing this skull. I'd be thinking a lot about the textures at these halftones where light turns to shadow. Just gonna pop this back up. We're just about done anyway, but just for my close, I was just going to go back to our drawing of this. Get back into focus. Drawing of this this moon surface. So thinking about this texture along the halftone edge, and as you saw with the skull. So yeah, it's seemingly quite a minor point, but definitely something that if you start to think about, it will really help your drawings and your paintings. And pretty much any subject. Same thing actually applies for landscapes. So you think about the same thing with landscapes. If you know the direction of the light, the direction of the sun as it drops down lower to the horizon, it alters the surface of the landscape. So you know that effect where you see kind of tussocky grass will suddenly become a lot more textured when it's lit in twilight versus when it's lit directly from above in the middle of the day. So yeah, definitely something to look out for. And that's it for today. I'll see you guys soon with probably a new series, something a bit more sustained. I just thought this would be a useful little one after our charcoal drawing portrait set series that we did recently. But yeah, that's it. As always, you guys can subscribe to watch more videos on OCAD, and if you click the link through, you can see what courses you can take with myself and other expert tutors. That's it. I'll see you soon.